Hi students, and welcome to this lecture on printmaking. This lecture is going to specifically look at the work of Andy Warhol to talk about the process of printmaking, but also to get us thinking about a couple key questions that come up with printmaking, such as how the process of printmaking might change the role of the artist and make us rethink the originality of an artwork. So we'll get going right away. Here are some of the learning objectives for this lecture. First, we'll define what a print is, and then characterize the relief process in printmaking. And then we'll look specifically at silkscreen as a process of printmaking to discuss Andy Warhol himself as an artist, the role of the artist, and what printing does to the idea of a quote-unquote original artwork. So before we get to discussing Warhol's work, what is printmaking? So many of you probably already know what printmaking is. If you ever worked with stamps as a child, you actually have printed. A print is an image printed from an engraved plate, wooden block, or similar surface. With my kids, I've made prints using apples, right? You can cut something out of the apple and then put ink or paint on it and then print it. It's basically just the transferring of ink from one surface to another. So stamps do that. So you probably kind of can understand the process in a very simplified way if you think about that. The other thing about printing is that prints allow artists to investigate the meaning of mechanical reproduction. So this is printmaking does involve the hand, especially certain types of printmaking. However, it also involves machines and can be done mechanically. So that's something to think about as well in terms of the artist and how their work may be original, because as we'll talk about later, the act of printing allows an artist to make multiples. So you can make 20 prints in one sitting versus, if you're creating a painting and painstakingly in your studio for years, you probably only make one painting, right? So we'll get there in just a moment. In printmaking, the process creates an impression of the image that is then transferred through pressure onto paper from a matrix. The matrix is basically the object that's been carved into, in which the design, on the surface onto which the design has been created. So here with the image that I have up, this looks like either a piece of wood that's been carved into likely, and then of course what you see is the flowers themselves. Just a couple more key terms to bring up. Multiple impressions can come from the same matrix. For instance, if you have one matrix like this wood block, you can use it multiple times, and you can put different colors in different areas and then use it to print over and over and over again. And then the images that were in the same, were used by the same matrix would be called an addition. Artists also often reserve a small number of additional proofs or trial impressions for personal use. So you can see here in this image that this artist has created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? They've created a bunch of prints and it probably didn't take them all that long, and they used the same matrix. So what does this do to the role of the artist? Well, to get to those questions, as I've said, I'd like to talk more about a specific artist, Andy Warhol. The reason I like to talk about him is because many of you know him, or you know of him. You've heard his name. He's a pop culture icon, but you might not know more specifically about the reasons why he did his work. You probably know about his Campbell soup cans, and you probably are annoyed by it, perhaps, because you're like, this isn't art, what? So I hope to give you a little more clarification on on him today and help you work through that. But first, let's talk about his process. So he did primarily silkscreen, formerly known as serigraph. There's no heavy machinery that's really needed to make a print. So you can see here on this image, you can make a print on a t-shirt or whatever using silkscreen, and it can be a very manual process as well. I've got a couple t-shirts here. I invite you to look down right now, and if you're wearing a t-shirt, it's probably screen printed. And if we were in class together, it would be more fun because I'd walk around and point to all your shirts, and most of them are screen printed, if not embroidered. Here's another one. I'm just digging through some of my clothes. So screen printing is all around us, everywhere. And if you go any room that you enter into, you probably have someone who has a silk screen printed shirt on. It's very, very common within our culture. It's basically any sports shirt that you have, anything with a logo on it. If it's not embroidered, which means stitched with some sort of yarn, it has this nice ink on it. That's silk screen. So it's all over, it's everywhere. Principles are similar to those required for stenciling. So if you think about ever making a stencil, in proper technique, shapes are not cut, but glue is painted in the area where the artist does not want the ink to flow through. And then you put ink on top, and then you use a squeegee to then pull the ink across the screen. And of course, it's a very thin netting, so only a little bit of ink will go through. And then of course you put it under heat, and then it fixes the image to the shirt. The reason why this is of interest to me is because my parents are actually screen printers. They have a t-shirt shop. That's what they do for their income. So I'm a trained screen printer through and through. If you need me to make any shirts, let me know. Just kidding. But this is the process. It looks like this if you go to a shirt shop. But obviously very similar to what Warhol was doing in his studio. So let's take a look at his studio. And here I actually want us to take a look at two different artists' studios. So one is Andy Warhol in his studio. We've been talking a little bit about him. I do think it's important to note that his studio, he called it the factory. I have that written down here. He did not call it a studio, he called it a factory. We'll talk about why that is in just a moment. And then on the other side, we have Salvador Dali, another artist you likely know, and this was him in his studio in the 1940s. He's a Spanish artist. So what are the key differences that you notice about these two artists' studios? Obviously, you're not here. I'll give you a moment to think. Something you'd probably say if you were in class with me is, okay, this guy, Dali, he looks like he's kind of losing it, right? He's looking like he's been in the studio, not sleeping for days, you know, painstakingly working on this painting. He's got sketches up. He's got tools. Here's his paint. He's got books open. He does not look happy. He looks really tired. And honestly, as an anecdote, something to note about Salvador Dali, is he was a surrealist. So he was an artist and interested in surrealism. So that is the things that happen in our minds, the things that happen in our dreams. So he was famous for sleep depriving himself. He's known to have created a type of device that would wake him up. Basically, he would put a spoon, it had something, I have to look it up again, but it had something to do with a spoon. He would hold a spoon in his hand as he was about to fall asleep, and then below the spoon, he'd have like a metal plate, so that the moment that he fell asleep and he dropped the spoon, it would drop onto a metal plate and wake him up. Because he thought that his very best ideas came on the brink of sleep, when he was just he was just in between consciousness and subconsciousness, in between that area. And many of the surrealists felt this way. He is one of the surrealists who is famous for sleep depriving himself. So obviously he looks that way here. In the other image, in the factory, Andy Warhol, you see the artist who seems to be active. He's got all of these prints, artworks on the floor. You can count all the bananas he's printed. Each banana probably took him 5 minutes, less than maybe. Once it's all set up, it's all from the same matrix, right? Probably the same screen. He's got some self-portraits of himself here. You can't even count how many bananas you have here. So the reason I'm bringing these two up is to think about the changing role of the artist. And so we have the artist as genius, the artist as, tortured in their studio for days, months, trying to work on one single work. And when it's done, they just have that one work. Whereas on the other hand, Warhol is using, matrices and printing multiple works at the same time very, very quickly. So he's been in a studio for one day, and look at all the works that he's made. So something to note here, that the artist, and also look at the craft that's involved with Dali. So you have a real interest in, shading, light, composition, everything that's going on here, right? He's classically trained as an artist. versus Andy Warhol, who also was classically trained, but ended up working in advertising after graduating from art school, who is not really worried about the way that the banana turns out. If it doesn't look perfect, he doesn't care, right? So there's an interest in shifting away from kind of the idea of the artist as a genius who's elevated above the rest of us to kind of an everyday person who isn't really worried about errors and stuff like that. So there's big shifts that are happening here with printmaking. So that brings us to this question, and here's an image of Warhol in his studio. This is him with these lovely black boots here, and of course he has a couple assistants. You can see he's just printed a big old Campbell's soup can on the floor. So the questions that I think are important to bring up, which I've already brought up, are, is there something less original than about prints? What happens to the notion of the original artwork? For instance, Dali has this one single work, and this work is seen as being so important. It's an original, right? I can own it in some ways if I buy a print of it from prints.com or whatever for $50, or probably like $15. But I don't own the original, right? The original painting is actually probably in the Museo del Prado, which is the important art museum in Spain, or the MoMA, perhaps in New York. And so there's this idea, and then, however, Warhol's pieces, right? He's got all these bananas. So which one is original, right? Well, they're all original. There's 15 bananas that were made that day. Every single one of them is original. So it kind of changes the idea of what we think about the original, perhaps. And we've already talked about the role of the artist changing, maybe moving away from the idea of the artist being someone who's classically trained, has to create something that is just really stimulating and beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, to the artist as kind of a different type of producer of culture that doesn't necessarily need to be so high culture. And so that brings us to our kind of a conversation about subject matter. So we've looked at, you guys all know the Mona Lisa. It's in the Louvre in Paris. It's really important, right? It perhaps is the most well-known artwork in the history of art. All of you know it, all of you have seen it. Some of you might own a print of it, right? You've seen it, it's a pop culture icon. From 1503 by Da Vinci. So this is a real original, right? The original, painted and finished in 1503, is housed behind bulletproof glass, police barricades in Paris, in the Louvre. It is a single piece that the artist worked on for a very long time, many years. And then we have, and it's, it's this woman, Lisa, who, was a rich guy's wife in 1503, and commissioned Da Vinci to create a portrait of her. Okay, that's great. Now we have Andy Warhol who's saying, guess what else is a really important subject matter? Soup. So it tends to make us think, like, what is he talking about? Why is soup so important? And the other thing I want you to notice here, and we'll talk about it later, is repetition, the use of repetition. It's not just one soup can, right? It's a bunch of them. And why would that repetition be necessary? So we have this juxtaposition here. Subject matter is much different in the Campbell's soup can. Well, now I want you to actually think about stuff around you. So take a moment, look around you. What do you see? Pick up a few things that you're finding next to you. Okay. Well, I've got my t-shirts here. I've got a scrunchie from my daughter. Got some books. What do you have? Now, take a look and tell me if anything was made homemade. If anything was made in the USA. If not, oh, this shirt was actually made in the USA. Very impressive. Go me. This one has an old tag, so I don't even know. Probably made in Vietnam. This scrunchie, I got it from Target a while ago for my daughter. It's probably made in China. Let's see, I have a water bottle over here, made in China. So look around, right? Think about the things you're wearing. Many things that we have today are made abroad, you know, not made in America? And even if they are, do you think that they're homemade by someone who's like a little lady sitting on her porch making you something? Probably not. For instance, like my water bottle, you can go to Target. I keep saying Target. I'm from Minnesota, so that's our Target is our brand. So you look at the bottom of your a water bottle, you can go to Target and there's like, you buy the water bottle and then there's 10 other water bottles behind it that look exactly the same, right? So my point is everything is mass produced today. If you happen to have a hat or something that your grandma made in the room you're in, wonderful, that's so great. But it's really, really likely that there's a bunch of stuff that you own that is made in China. If you have kids, look at their toys sometimes. All of the toys are made in China, and all of them are mass produced in factories, right? Where am I going with this? Well, where do you think Warhol gets this idea to do a mass produced object? So he's living in the 1960s. He's thinking to himself, well, we don't live in a homemade culture anymore. We don't live in a place where art is made doesn't have to be made by hand. Why don't we start reflecting our culture, which is, you know, all about mass production, which is all about making things in mass, in factories, right? Machines are making objects, not people. So he says, well, shouldn't art reflect this move? And so he starts thinking about his method of production, stops doing drawings and starts making prints where he can work in a more mechanical way, almost as if he's a machine, and he's working in his factory, right? I spoke about that earlier. So he calls it the factory because he's basically, you know, putting out work as quick as a factory can put out the water bottle at Target, right? And so that's something that's important that we keep, needs to be brought up with our Warhol. Another thing that I think is important, as you see here, is the use of the Campbell's soup can itself. This is a mass-consumed type of food. Food used to be homemade, and then, you know, all of a sudden, factories started making food in the like 30s. And so Campbell's soup was one of these big things like, oh, you don't have to make food anymore, because it used to be kind of a woman's job. It was very seen as the woman's role to be very overwhelmed with domesticity and the things that you do in the household, and making dinner, lunch, and breakfast was part of your job. And this was the first time where, not in the 60s, but, you know, he's working off of that. This was when, you know, women didn't have to do that anymore. You could come home and just open a can of soup and put it in the pot, and there it was. So this is mass-produced food. So he's thinking about kind of this low culture mass-produced food and then elevating it to the realm of high art. So just a couple more things to think about. I've already gone over this. Here's an image of Warhol and some of his assistants in his factory. This guy is cracking me up back here. So made in the factory, not in the studio, he would stress, using a machine-like process. Mass-produced multiples can be made in a matter of minutes. So look at all these flower prints that he's made. Art should reflect the industrial culture of today, right? Nothing is homemade. So what makes this different from an advertisement? The Campbell's soup can that you see over on the right side, this is a piece of artwork produced in the factory of Andy Warhol. This is a print. And what you see over on the left here, this is actually advertising that was made by the marketing department for Campbell's soup. So what's the difference? Well, something that I want to share with you real quick. I want to go to the Christie's webpage. Christie's is a really premier auction house. They sell really expensive, important artworks. If you look at this work by Andy Warhol, Campbell's soup can, you can see that it costs $9 million. That's pretty insane. So I'll go back. I don't know if any of you have, you know, that kind of cash sitting around, but I don't. So what is the big deal? How come the person who makes the marketing image doesn't get paid, but Warhol takes it to his studio in the 60s and says, oh, I'm just going to recreate that, and people love it, right? Well, it's all about location. So location transforms something mundane like this into an artwork. So once you move an image like this into the gallery, it is elevated because it's attached to Warhol, his process, and also the 1960s culture where there was a real interest in mass consumption, mass production, this type of thing. And just to bring in a few other artists working in the 90s, Andreas Gursky was an artist, still is an artist working in the medium of photography, also interested in mass consumption. This is how our stores look, right? You go on, oh, I need a loaf of bread. Well, there's 15 other loaves of bread next to it, right? Oh, I need a vacuum, another work by the same artist, Media Market. Oh, there's 15 vacuums that have been mass produced, probably in a foreign country, you know, probably by people who are underpaid, probably by young people who are underpaid. And so we tend to forget about all this, out of sight, out of mind, but it is important that we think about that kind of invisibilized labor. And these artists are helping us to think through that. I do like to bring up, though, the Etsy trend that has been happening for the last probably 10 years or so. Some of you might know about Etsy. This is like an online platform that tries to give people who homemake objects a platform so that they can sell their homemade objects also on the internet, and they're not always mass produced. The last thing I wanted to mention with Warhol is his interest in repetition. So we've talked about repetition as an important principle of design. He uses it very specifically in his work. So now I want you to think about the way that you see advertisements. If you see a Coke advertisement, do you only see it once? Maybe you see it twice. No, you see it over and over and over, and it is shoved down your throat, into your face. You're driving down the highway and there it is, Coke, refreshing, or there it is, you know, go to this store, buy this thing, right? And so it's everywhere. And now that all of us are on our computers all the time, it is everywhere in our computers because, of course, everyone knows our computers are tracking us and they know what we search, it's archived, and so they know what we want to buy. And so you're just on your Facebook page or whatever, oh, there's an ad for, you know, tennis balls, because somehow they know that you play tennis and you're out of tennis balls, right? Because of the other things that are being tracked. So this is the way that advertisement works. And this is why Warhol is interested in repetition, because he sees himself elevating kind of advertising and mass-produced objects. But he doesn't give it to you once. He wants to give it to you over and over and over again to mimic the way that we are bombarded in everyday culture with images of advertisement, mass production. You know, you need this, buy this, right? So you see that here in Campbell's soup cans. And the other image that I have here, this is called Green Car Crash. And I will talk about repetition here as well. This is another print from one of Warhol's series. It's called A Death and Dying. That was part of the series. So images of car crashes, images of the from the local newspaper of, I'm blanking on it, death penalty, electric chairs. So real interest in death and dying. And he would say that he was, you know, death and dying are not things that are really jarring to us anymore. Unfortunately, we see images of people dying. We see images of death. We see images of violence all the time. And this summer was full of images of people killing people. We see it a lot, and how many of us are really all that shaken up by it, maybe with the exception of a few things. But you see car crashes like this was an image that he just took from the local newspaper in 1963. There's an image of a car crash, the car is upside down, it's burning. You might not be able to see it, but look closely. There's a man who has been projected from the vehicle and is accidentally like hanging on a nail that was on this pole. You might even miss that, right? And because we've become so desensitized to this. And the reason for our desensitization is because we see stuff over and over and over. Violence has just been there for many of us since we were little. We've seen it, right? So by the time you've seen this image over, the first time you see it, you might be like, oh my gosh, that's horrifying. And then you see it again and again and again, and it's overlapping itself, and it's blurred, and it's again and again and again. By the time you're done looking at it at the end down here, it no longer does anything to you. So this does mimic the ways in which we see advertisements, but also images of violence and death. So that's what he's interested in here. And it works really well, and so specifically using repetition in works like Campbell's Soups Cans and Green Car Crash, as you see here. I hope this helps. Please let me know if you have further questions, and I will talk to you with more lectures next week.